Hello and welcome. Thanks for joining us today on this session on innovating in the cloud and the 5 mistakes to avoid making. With me on this session is Brett Raven, who I will introduce you to a little bit later on. But for now, just a quick introduction on myself. Obviously, my name is Kareem. I founded a company called Solentive Systems about 30 years ago. And in that time, I've been delivering digital solutions for companies in all corners of the world. And as you can imagine, there's been some fantastic successful projects, and there's also been some learnings along the way. And those learnings today, I hope to share some of them with you. Over to you, Brett.
Thanks, Kareem. Brett Raven here. I've been in the software industry for over 30 years as well. More recently, other than being a very hands-on technical person doing software engineering and solution architecture and enterprise architecture, I've also been a CTO and CIO for some of Australia's largest and leading e-commerce brands. My current role, however, is a Chief Customer Technology Advisor at Salesforce, and I should caveat this call by saying that my opinions do not necessarily reflect those of my employer. Back to you, Kareem.
Okay, so before we get going, just some quick definitions. First of all, the cloud. Now, I know that's a word well used, and most people have some understanding of what the cloud is, but for the point of synchronicity, just a quick definition on how we're going to use it. So when we say the cloud, we mean a collection of services sitting on infrastructure in data centers distributed around the world. Those services are provided by cloud service providers, which we'll talk a little bit about later on. The most common flavor is public cloud, where as a user or an entity, you share the tenancy with other users and entities, as opposed to a private cloud where the tenancy is all yours. And then there's the hybrid cloud, which, as the name suggests, is a combination, but not only of public and private, but also potentially of on-prem systems as well. Cloud migration is the process of moving technology into the cloud. And there are 3 terms that we're going to refer to in this presentation. IaaS short for infrastructure as a service, PaaS short for platform as a service, and SaaS short for software as a service. And there's a special flavor of SaaS called APaaS, which is application platform as a service. This diagram gives you a bit of an indication of how much and how little is being provided by a cloud service provider. So obviously, in the case of IaaS, the cloud service provider is providing the least, and in the case of SaaS, they're providing the most infrastructure, and PaaS sits somewhere in between. So I'm going to pass you over to Brett for this next slide to just give us a bit more of a detailed explanation.
Thanks. So really, there's 4 columns here that describe the different levels of capability that you have across what you need in order to run an enterprise application. So each one of the boxes, let's start off on the left-hand side. Everything that this is, those dark blue boxes are what is required for you as a user in a company to own and manage. Everything from servers and storage all the way up through middleware, application and data and so on. So on-premise is the heaviest lifting part, and it will be the most expensive for the most part. As you move towards the right, you can see infrastructure as a service. Those light blue boxes indicate the things that are actually taken off your plate, so less of a headache for you. And that infrastructure as a service really is providing you with the base infrastructure, so servers effectively, and it looks after networking and security and storage. Platform as a service goes that next layer up, which is really looking at the runtime and the middleware, and in fact the operating system. So it maintains the operating system capabilities for you. In lots of cases, they'll provide frameworks that you can use to build your applications on top of. And then all the way to the right, software as a service supplements the platform as a service capability by providing you with applications or application starting points and a data model. And we'll get more to that a little bit later in the slides.
Okay. Making is choosing the wrong cloud provider. Now, there are a number of cloud providers out there, but there's a handful of names that I'm sure you've heard of. First and foremost, I suppose, is Amazon Web Services, or AWS. AWS was the first mover, and as a result, they have about 48% of the market. They've managed to set up data centers in every pocket of the world, so it's a great option if you're looking for a local data center. But they've also managed to set up multi-region tenancies, so which abstracts you from where the actual data centers are. So if you want a tenancy that spans across multiple regions, AWS was one of the first to get that working well. They're known for the deployment speed, and a lot of Amazon clients are can do 10 or 12 deployments a day. They have a free tier option, which is great if you just wanted to try before you buy. And they also have flexible pricing. Now, pricing is an interesting beast because each of them price differently, and comparing prices is a very complex process and not very easy to achieve an apples for apples scenario. So getting your head around pricing is something that you need to sort of put a bit of effort into. Brett, how's your experience with AWS been?
So AWS really is the origination of a business that was set up by Amazon as an e-commerce business. There was a business they were looking at called Merchant.com. And the business idea behind Merchant.com was to provide a platform that allowed organizations like Target and Walmart and so on to set up an e-commerce platform really quickly. During that process, they had some brainstorming sessions, and they realized that they would be over-investing in extra hardware and software and services that would be required during peak seasons like Christmas and Black Friday and Cyber Monday. So they postulated how they may be able to get around this problem, and in doing so, they came up with a plan around how virtualization may work, how they could share storage and resources, and really flex that capability up and down. And as a result, they realized that they had something as more of a business model than just providing services for Merchant.com, and they expanded it out into the market. Now, AWS has such a good first mover advantage, as you've mentioned. They're the pioneers really in infrastructure as a service, and to some degree, even platform as a service with some of their offerings they have. The nice thing about Amazon is AWS inherits the Amazon culture, and there's 14 key values that Amazon will talk about, and AWS also lives by these values. One of those values is customer obsession, and they do live and breathe customer obsession. And the way that they do that is by, if you're a big enough customer especially, well, even the small customers will get access to this as well, but they have an account manager who actively looks at your account and tries to find you ways to save money, which is pretty rare these days when it comes to technology providers. So AWS, half the market ownership right now. They're really hard to compete with, and they're doing really well.
Okay, the next cab off the rank is Microsoft Azure. So Azure came into the market obviously behind AWS. As a result, they're only up to 20% of the market share, but they're moving very quickly. In fact, I think that's the fastest growing cloud service provider. They've built a highly integrated environment. So if you run a Microsoft shop, you'll find that the the Azure tools will integrate very easily with the Microsoft suite. So whether that be Microsoft 365 or the Dynamics suite, for example. Coming into the market later than AWS, they've obviously come in with some aggressive pricing. So you could find that they're very cost effective. And one of the things that they have touted quite strongly, and in fact, I remember seeing their CEO, Satya Nadella, at a Microsoft conference talking quite proudly about their security and their privacy. So they're very big on security and privacy, although I would say that all the major players have put quite a bit of focus on this, but it's definitely something that Microsoft are making a big deal about. They also started off in IaaS. So they're obviously very strong with IaaS, especially around providing virtual machines for Windows Server environments. But then, like all the other cloud service providers, they moved into PaaS, and so they've got a very strong PaaS offering. Okay, so when it comes to the remaining three in the top five, there's Alibaba that has about 8% of the market, and that's mainly to service the Chinese market. But Brett, what's your experience been with Alibaba?
Look, Ali obviously has a huge foothold in the Chinese marketplace. The advantage they have by operating in the country, and in fact being somewhat owned by government, gives them the opportunity to work behind the great Chinese firewall, which is always a bit of a difficulty when you're dealing with with a country like this. Having these bigger organizations like Microsoft and Amazon and even Google to a certain degree, getting behind that firewall proves to be challenging. So I think Ali is going to continue to grow in this space. I think as China develops into a more mature market, they'll continue to own that market pretty wholeheartedly. It'll be really tough to de-seat them and compete with them in that space.
Okay, owning about 5% of the market is the Google Cloud Platform. And so Google obviously have come in reasonably late into the game, but they've been slowly and steadily taking up market share. They're very strong in research and data, and they've got a number of really cool data-oriented tools, such as their BigQuery offering. Have you had much exposure to GCP, Brett?
Yeah, GCP really, I think where it came from, and this is conjecture, but I think I'm pretty close. A lot of customers that gather tons of data on Google AdWords and Google Analytics, which everybody uses unless you have a website these days, really wanted access to drill into that raw data. So Google Cloud Platform gives you that access directly using the BigQuery product and a few other tools that they have accessible to them. And really you get access to the full data set, the full set of information that you're gathering based on customer behavior. So I really see GCP getting into the market from that perspective. I do know that they are trying hard to get into more of the compute space, and they have taken up a bit of market share, but as you can see, at 5%, they're pretty late entrants, and it's going to be quite hard for them to catch up. But watch this space. You know, they tend to invest pretty heavily in certain areas that become niche for Google Cloud, for Google in general. And I know that they do invest quite heavily in things like AI, especially when it comes to things like customer experience and customer behavior data. So I think watch this space. Google will be one to contend with.
Okay, so coming in at number 5 in our top 5 is the IBM Cloud. Now, IBM have a long history with government, and I think they've done a reasonably good job of getting their government clients onto the IBM Cloud. But I think IBM is probably most famous for its Watson offering, which is a sort of productized AI implementation. So Watson's probably been around the longest of all the AI offerings. While they all have, well, each of the platforms have some form of artificial intelligence capabilities. It's just, I think the IBM one is the one that's probably most recognized as a brand. And then other than the top 5, which take up 85%, the remainder sit in 15% of the market. Okay, so what are the factors for choosing the right cloud service provider? Firstly, you need to make a decision. Are you going IaaS, PaaS, APaaS, or SaaS? This is a decision that's going to sit with you for a long time. If you get this wrong, like a bad choice of lifelong partner, you could end up with a very difficult situation. However, if you get it right, it could be very fruitful for all parties. Brett, do you have some views on this?
Yeah, as we discussed earlier, if we remember the slides that I showed earlier, the difference between infrastructure as a service all the way through to software as a service. I think the more you go to the right-hand side towards software as a service, the bigger the commit it is. You're quite portable in the infrastructure as a service space, especially if you're looking at just pure compute and storage. But as you progress further through platform and application platform and through SaaS as well, you're committing to more and more of the fabric of the provider that you're getting into. Now, I used to be against this to a certain degree. I was a bit more of a purist when I was in my early parts of my career, and my thinking was really, I don't want to be married to any one vendor for a long period of time necessarily. But as I've gone through the process of building enterprise applications and e-commerce platforms and so on, I can see huge benefits in committing more to a platform type play. So choosing a partner becomes a lot more critical as you get to the further end of town, which is the SaaS side of things. But when you do that, you're actually giving yourself a lot more negotiating power. You're getting a lot of benefit of what we consider platform thinking, which means that data exists all in one place and you can leverage that data across different areas of your business. So in doing so, platform thinking really de-silos a lot of the areas that businesses are dealing with now. You may have an e-commerce platform, a customer relationship platform, a sales platform, a marketing platform. And a lot of organizations, these are disparate systems that could even be homegrown. And a lot of the problems that get created from doing this is having that integration capability that needs to be built and rolled out. And then off the back of that, you get your data problems, business intelligence, and so on. So that platform as a service piece and software as a service is probably where you'd spend more time making a decision on the partner. But when you do, you're all in. It's a good thing. It's not a bad thing anymore, but just make sure you choose wisely.
Okay, the next point to take into account is the feature set. Actually, it's a combination of a few different things, but they all sort of tie in together. You make sure that the feature set is the right set for what you're trying to do. And generally speaking, the providers will all provide some form of some similarity, if you like, of features with respect to the others. But the way those features are offered can vary from platform to platform. So I think it's important that your tech team, whether that be an internal or an external provider, are comfortable with and prefer the features that that particular cloud service provider is offering. Again, it's useful to get customer references to see how other customers have experienced that platform. And then the local support is an important one, because the way you're going to be supported by the team on the ground may well impact your project. So it's really important to get a sense of the people that are local to you. And there's a few other things such as redundancy and recovery and points of presence. Any other comments would you like to add, Brett?
You know, feature set comparison between especially the top 2 or 3 really becomes a bit muddled after a while. I think they're all trying to approach the market with different kinds of offerings, but at the same time, there's a lot of sort of status quo capabilities that people are looking for these days. So usually where the differentiation comes in is when somebody has built something that's unique, or they've made an acquisition, or they've done a deal with somebody. You know, in the case of Google Cloud, for example, they're very much an open source organization. So they tend to try and draw in more open source capabilities within that stack. So if you're an organization that's very open source focused, then Google Cloud's a place to look. Whereas if you go further into the end of town of, you know, Amazon, for example, they have built their own products, so you get a bit more tied into the platform too. So I think the comparison to feature sets and customer references and so on is critical. I do think though that there's an apples and oranges situation that really comes down to what your tech stack is, which I know that we're going to talk about soon.
Okay, so wherever you are in the world, compliance and accreditation are very important. Obviously, different regions have different compliance standards, so you got to just make sure that the cloud service provider does comply with those standards in the right way. The next thing to think about is the pricing model, and I sort of referred to this earlier on. They all price differently, and it can be really quite an in-depth job to get all the pricing to line up in such a way that you can compare them. So getting your head around the individual pricing, I think, is quite an important part of choosing the right cloud service provider, because otherwise you could end up with a situation where you have the wrong pricing model, and that is not something that you necessarily want to live with in perpetuity. Okay, I'm now going to hand over to Brett to talk a little bit about avoiding choosing the wrong tech stack.
Thanks, Kareem. So tech stacks, really want to put a bit of a definition in here just to keep it simple. Most applications have 3 definitive layers. There's a presentation layer. You may have heard this called the front end or user interface or UI, or the client, the application layer, so the back end server capability, and then some form of database layer, data repository. So the reason why I want to talk about this is because it's important to choose, if you're building something as a custom application, which these technologies are kind of focused on in the context of this slide, then you need to choose carefully. So across the top, we have examples of different kinds of frameworks and languages that presentation layers are used. This is, again, based on the web technologies that we're talking about here, given that we're talking about cloud. So you can see on the right-hand side, JavaScript, HTML, and CSS. Those are by far the dominant technologies that exist from a browser perspective. So user interface and clients for web browsers are built generally in those 3 technologies. Now, what people have done over the years is they've abstracted capability into JavaScript frameworks that they've made in an attempt to make it easier for developers to write code and get to application outputs pretty quickly. So React, based on Facebook, you know, it's been around for a number of years now, is a pretty popular UI framework. Angular comes from Google. Again, it's been around for quite many years, very tried and tested, and it does provide a certain set of capabilities that would be hard to achieve in a short period of time using just JavaScript on its own. jQuery has been around for a long, long time. It was really one of the first kind of key adopted frameworks for the user interface, and it's all, again, based on JavaScript. But really what's happened is people have written all these libraries and capabilities that allow you to get there faster from a user experience perspective. There's a few other I put in there. I won't go through these in detail right now. In the application layer, you've got the .NET framework. It's been around for also many years, probably 10 to 20 years now. Spring on the right-hand side, that's a Java implementation. And as you can see, there's languages on the right-hand side that may associate with some of these frameworks like Java and C#. Node.js. So there's all these different frameworks that you can choose from to build your backend application. Now, one of the things that I try and advise, especially people coming up in the technology industry, starting their career early, is not to camp yourself specifically in any one of these technologies. As far as I'm concerned, and I've had this conversation with many people in the tech industry, syntax is not the issue. So the language that you choose, I would suggest the language and the frameworks and so on, you pick something that's widely accepted, widely supported, and has a large talent pool to draw from. The last thing you want to do is pick something obscure, that's, you know, the latest and greatest potentially, but only has a small pool of people to draw from, because you'll be either struggling to find the right people, or you'll be paying a lot extra for those people, and sometimes for people to pay you'll be paying people to learn on the job as well. So avoid shiny new toys when it comes to tech stack. On the database layer side of things, there's really two camps here, not about languages and frameworks, but more about relational databases, so traditional RDBMS technology, thinking SQL Server, Oracle, Postgres, and MySQL. And on the right-hand side, we have technologies called NoSQL or document-based databases. And I won't get into the details between these two, but really it's fit for purpose depending on what you're trying to achieve. And they do tend to create some affinity for your tech stack as well. So the combination of these three layers, the technologies that you choose, absolutely important. You have to make sure that you choose wisely. Go to the next slide, please. Now, platform as a service is something that's a bit different. And I mentioned before that this is probably a good place for you to consider if you're building enterprise applications and you're working on systems that are really, about managing data, doing reporting, business intelligence, sharing information, tracking information, and so on. So we have a number of different options in here. Obviously, Salesforce platform, it's been around for over 20 years. It's really an adaptable framework that starts off with a whole set of features and capabilities and data models that you can use to leverage to create more of a customized approach for your business or enterprise. OutSystems been around for less of amount of time. This is more of a custom build framework that you can work off of. So it has some different kinds of flexibilities compared to the other products. And, they've been a bit of an upcomer. One of the things this product does is it actually generates code that you can then compile in .NET, and you can own that code afterwards. So there's a few on here, Microsoft Dynamics CRM and Microsoft Power Apps. These two things work in kind of conjunction. Dynamics CRM, Salesforce Platform, Zoho, they all start off with a set of base functionality you then customize for your business. So you don't need to create a new account structure or a new lead management system or how to manage cases and so on. These things come out of the box depending on the licensing that you provide, and you can modify those to make your business run better and faster. So the reason why I'd like to focus on this area is because platform as a service really takes out the headache of all the things that happen underneath an enterprise platform to make sure that you can innovate and spend time innovating rather than keeping the lights on.
Okay, thanks for that, Brett. So the third mistake to avoid making is choosing the wrong implementation partner. And this particular point, I think, is probably the most akin to choosing a life partner, because if you get this right, it could be a long and fruitful relationship. If you get it wrong, it can be quite a messy breakup. So there's a few factors to think about. First and foremost, cultural alignment. So every business has its own culture, and depending on what segment you're in and the specific business will define the kind of culture you have. If you're in a highly regulated environment, you may well have a very corporate culture. And I think it's important to get an implementation partner that matches that, whether they be highly corporate themselves or very used to working in corporate environments, because obviously if they're, say, more creative, less governed by nature, culturally speaking, you might find that there's going to be some friction in that. And vice versa. So obviously, if you're a very creative business, you may not want a highly processized, if you like, corporate-y implementation partner. So that's something to definitely think about before choosing the right partner. Now, methodology is all important. You don't want your implementation partner just doing whatever they think or feel is the right thing to do at the time. They've got to be following some standard form of methodology, but methodology has to be something that's providing some form of governance and direction, but cannot be the ultimate rule book, because in technology, as we all know, everything is changing all the time. So it's got to have some flexibility. So it's got to have that maturity, but also have that flexibility. So that's something that you want to make sure that you get your head around when choosing your implementation partner. What is their methodology like? Domain expertise can be quite important. If you've got a vendor or a partner who has worked in your domain before, that can be quite advantageous. It's also useful to have a partner who has worked in other domains who can bring expertise across domains into your particular project. Now, this one's probably quite obvious, but a proven track record is all important. You certainly don't want anybody learning on your dime. So making sure that you understand where they've done similar work before. And then making sure that they are aligned with your business objectives, because it's all well and good to build beautiful code that runs really quickly, but if it doesn't solve business problems, it's kind of a waste of time. And then finally, the capability. I think everybody focuses on the capability. Do they have this skill set? Do they have that skill set? Those skill sets are all important, but I think we've got to make sure that we put them in the right at the right level of importance with respect to all the other factors when choosing an implementation partner. Brett, knowing that you've been on both sides of the fence, what are your views on implementation partners?
Yeah, implementation partner choice is critical to the success of any project. And I think one of the things to keep in mind is you need to treat it like a true partnership. So making sure that you have cultural alignment and value alignment, I think that's really important, and making sure that you can communicate with each other in an effective manner. What I highly recommend, though, is, again, treat it like a true partnership. Don't treat the supplier like somebody who's doing the work for you. You have to work together to make sure you have an outcome that is a win-win situation. So the last thing that you need to be doing is trying to beat the supplier up and extract as much capability from them and work out of them for the least amount of money. I think it's important for you to have an attitude where the supplier needs to come away feeling like they've won and you have won as well. So that whole concept of win-win, I think, is something that's really important, and that comes in the next slide as well around the contractual discussions and how you do the engagement. But the implementation partner needs to have that mindset that it's a partnership and we're in this together, and you have to as a customer as well.
Okay, so the next mistake to avoid making is choosing the wrong engagement model. Now, this is quite highly tied to the previous point about choosing the right partner. I think people take for granted that coming to a mutually acceptable agreement is an easy thing. It's actually not an easy thing at all, because agreements are there for ultimately for when things don't work out, or at least contracts are. And so it's really the journey of getting to that sense of mutual agreement that is the valuable part of all of this. And you may find that this can be where a lot of deals sort of fall over, because people have all the best will in the world, but the way they want to engage is not compatible. So there are a number of points to bear in mind. Firstly, there are four main players. There's the business or the group that are going to get some benefit from the technology or from the cloud innovation that you're hoping to implement. There's going to be the tech team, or it might be an internal team, it might be an external vendor. Then there's finance, who always have an interest in how much money is being spent. And when you're using a third party to deliver the technology, then procurement comes into play, and they're there to make sure that the right deal is being had and that no money is being left on the table. So all four participants have to be given equal voice. If any one of them is overly dominant, it could lead to the failure of your project. The next thing to take into account is what kind of methodology you're going to use. Are you going to use waterfall, agile, and hybrid? Now, I know Brett's got some views on this, but there are a number of different methodologies out there. There's I suppose the original one, which is waterfall, and it's quite big in the physical building space. Then came agile about 10, 15 years ago, and it was all the flavor for a good decade or so. But more recently, people are looking at a more hybrid methodology, because there are obviously pros and cons with both. On top of that comes the costing model. Time and materials versus fixed costs versus target costs. They're three different models, but again, I'm going to let Brett talk a little bit about that, because he's done, well, we've both done quite a bit of negotiations in this area. I know he's just finished one recently, so there's some learnings there that he's going to share with us. And then we've got to be thinking about where the pain sits. Basically, the bottom line is to share the pain. If one party is troubled with more of the pain than the other, then that is not good for the long-term relationship, and that'll impact both parties. And then, of course, you're looking for that long-term relationship, so it's got to be sustainable for both. You've got to make sure that whether you're on the client side or the vendor side, that the other party in the overall project is also benefiting from it. And then the last thing is to make sure that there is no money being left on the table. So it's got to be a fair deal for everybody. Brett, again, I know you've got many views on this. What do you think?
Been on this road many times, so I think I've got a few experiences that I could share. But overall, let me address the first part: waterfall versus agile versus a hybrid of the two. it's pretty rare to find an organization, especially at the enterprise level, to find a CFO in particular that won't want to work in some sort of waterfall structure. Now, waterfall historically is how technology projects used to be done all the time, and it does give you a big Gantt chart and a set of dependencies and so on, and you can kind of, in theory, predict where the start and end is. But as we all know, projects never finish the way that they start. The plan changes all the way through, and including the requirements and so on. So waterfall conceptually used to be a good idea. Very hard to actually manage these days unless you know exactly what you want, and that doesn't tend to work for most projects as people do change their minds and as technology changes. Agile, the holy grail these days. I think there's a lot of hybrids around what Agile means. So really making Agile your own, and there could be some sort of combination of Agile and waterfall depending on your capability, really seems to be something that has to be agreed on up front. Now that engagement model is pretty key. There are different modifications of things like the unified process, the Agile unified process, the waterfall unified process, lots of different variations of it. But at the end of the day, you need a methodology that's flexible based on the changing requirements and the attitudes that you have with your partner. Now, commercially, again, these things kind of tie in with the above waterfall, Agile, and hybrid. Time and materials, probably best left for an established relationship or shorter engagements or business as usual type work, maintenance, and so on. I think it's hard sometimes to, as a customer especially, commit to a time and materials engagement for a large piece of work when you really don't know and how and what kind of budget you need to allocate, and therefore you don't know if you've been successful or not. Fixed cost, always fraught with issues. Again, fixed cost against a waterfall project may look like an appropriate way to run a project. At the end of the day, somebody's going to lose though. There's going to be a lot of infighting, there's going to be a lot of finger pointing, and that partnership will get strained because in a fixed cost approach, somebody has to lose. There's going to be a loser. Either the supplier takes a hit on their margin, or the customer takes a hit on the amount of cost that they expected to pay. Target cost is interesting though, and I think you highlighted this a little bit, Kareem, where there is this concept of shared pain and shared gain. If a project goes over budget, the over budget gets shared by half. If it goes under budget, the benefit of that under budget gets shared by half as well. So that really seems to work well in the building industry, and I know that I have seen it work really effectively in some of the engagements I've seen and people that I've spoken to in the industry. Now, as you say here, this is the key thing. Long-term and sustainable capability. You want to make sure that you walk away from the project thinking that you both have won. If you don't feel that way, the next project's going to be a lot harder. There's going to be a lot more buffer built into it in either way, and it's not going to be a good outcome for everybody. So between these two, this slide and the slide previous to this, choose your implementation partner properly, treat them like a good actual partner in that sense, and the same thing goes for the implementation partner. You're in this together.
And a small addition I would like to add, which is a variation, if you like, of target cost, no pun intended, is something that we refer to as cost target. And that's if you've got a fixed budget that you're working to, then both parties will work together on dealing with the scope, so what's in and what's out, as opposed to raising variations for anything new. If you've got something new that comes in along the way, you may want to deprioritize something so that you remain to budget. And that, of course, requires give and take. So in that instance, it's, again, both parties are involved in making those decisions and nobody loses in the interaction. Okay, so the next slide I've put in, just as a brief mention, security and privacy is such a major topic that it's worth a session of its own. So I'm just going to quickly run through some things before we go to the fifth and final point. So first of all, make sure that your data is encrypted, and again, that can be in flight, at rest, etc. Watch out for malware, ransomware, and viruses. Make sure that all your authentication is correct and it's all correctly audited. Protect your physical infrastructure. So don't forget that even the most secure systems in the world require some form of window into them. And if your physical front door is open, then intruders can get in. Social engineering. So this is an interesting one. In fact, Brett, maybe you could tell us a little bit more about social engineering.
Yep. Look, there's probably tons of stories I could tell you across the different bullet points you have here, Kareem. Social engineering is the one that I have seen effectively be the most destructive, and it's sometimes the most nefarious in a way. Really what this means is that a hacker or some individual gains access through nefarious means by convincing somebody within the organization to give some information up. So it could be as simple as making a phone call to an individual by guessing an extension number, stating that you are IT and you need to reset somebody's password and you ask for a password or some other identifier that compromises security. And then from there, the hacker has now been able to gain effectively internal access. This happens all the time, and social engineering also kind of sits with what I consider to be phishing. And that would be situations that this happens a lot these days, including things like ransomware off the back of this, where you may receive an email that looks like it's from your boss, or it could be from somebody, official looking like a government agency, and you click on it, and there's an attachment that looks maybe like a PDF. You click on that, it executes some code on your machine, encrypts a bunch of files, and then tells you have to pay a large Bitcoin ransom. So this does happen. It happens in organizations all over the place. It happened to me while I was a CTO at a company previously about 10 years ago. It is not a fun process to go through. And I think the key thing here is there's 2 points that really combat social engineering. One is vigilance, and 2 is education. You really need to be able to educate your team to ensure that they won't make the mistakes that have been made in the past.
Thanks for that, Brett. Another thing to avoid is denial of service attacks. That's when a nefarious actor is trying to block all the traffic to your site by sending extra traffic that has no benefit. And finally, monitoring and alerting. So you got to make sure that you are constantly monitoring your systems. Never assume that they are just okay. Okay, so the 5th and final mistake to avoid making when innovating in the cloud is making sure that you don't have the wrong digital strategy or have the right digital strategy. And so by having the right digital strategy, what we mean is, what are your measurements of success? How do you know that your wonderful cloud innovation is actually successful? You need to set out your measures of success before you even start. You also need to be able to know or be able to measure your return on investment. So what kind of return on investment are you expecting? And what is your road to getting that return on investment? And then finally, what is the threat to your business if you do nothing? Sometimes doing nothing is a viable option, but often it's not, especially in this age of digital transformation. So these are the things that you have to think about. Getting those decisions wrong could cost you a lot of money, potentially even cost you your business. So I'm going to hand over to Brett for the final word on the final point.
Digital strategy, something that has been a buzzword, and you can jam it in the middle of this whole concept of digital transformation. Kareem, I think this is something that we continue to hear, especially after COVID. It's really driving the change in an organization. So no longer is it just an option, but people must digitally transform. And having the right strategy for that is key to this whole process. Now, I like to use an enterprise architecture type approach to things. And really what that means is looking at the business strategy, taking that apart and looking at the goals and drivers that will achieve that business strategy. And then below that, you start capabilities. Now, capabilities in the business are not functions or jobs or roles. They're specific but static things that happen within an organization that actually makes the organization exist. So if you focus on the capabilities, the functions, and then the KPIs below that, you basically have a whole stream, effectively a stacked set of, diagram, if you will, and it will allow you to look at priorities of what capabilities should I implement and how much benefit will they have based on the KPIs that I've allocated to them. So digital strategy is important. If you fail to plan, you better plan to fail, as that old adage goes. But right now, in the times of COVID, the times of this rapid change, digital transformation, and having the right digital strategy is the single most important thing that you must focus on.
And with that, I'd like to thank you very much for your time, and I hope you benefit from this presentation today. Please feel free to reach out to either of us at any time if you have any questions. Thank you.
Thanks.